Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A Day in the Life of a TMF Document Overview. My name is Isaiah Howard, and I'm the Director of Marketing for LMK Clinical Research Consulting. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. Everyone should be listening in using your computer speakers system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select Telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the question box. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A sessions. I would now like to introduce Jackie Morrell, Director of Clinical Operations at LMK Clinical Research Consulting.
Thanks, Isaiah. Good morning to everyone joining us on today's call, A Day in the Life of a TMF Document. So before we get started, this is just a quick confidentiality disclaimer on behalf of LMK. So any distribution or dissemination of this presentation without prior approval from LMK is otherwise strictly prohibited. So just a little bit about myself. As Isaiah mentioned, I am the Director of Clinical Operations at LMK Clinical Research Consulting. I am a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt certified clinical research professional with nearly a decade of experience in clinical trial and process improvement within healthcare, biotech, and the pharmaceutical industries. Over the past several years, my entire focus has been on all things related to TMF. So I have experience overseeing eTMF implementation projects, coordination of large migration projects, when you're moving from paper TMF into a new eTMF platform or moving from one eTMF platform to another. I also have experience developing metrics and training programs, doing QC process improvement, and then also with helping to prepare for inspections by various different regulatory agencies, including FDA, MHRA, and PMDA. So before we get started, I think it's always important to talk about why the TMF is important. So we know that everyone dialing in today obviously sees some value in the TMF and is trying to broaden their knowledge base. But really and truly, the TMF is vitally important to every clinical study. At LMK, we really would argue that it's actually the most important aspect of a clinical study. And I will admit that we do get pushback on that sometimes, that people will say that other deliverables of a clinical trial, such as the CSR, may be more important. But if you were to get inspected by a regulatory agency, they're not coming just to look at any one component like the CSR. They're coming to look at your TMF in its entirety, because the TMF is ultimately what is going to allow them to assess the conduct of your clinical trial, the integrity of the data that that trial produced, and also compliance of the trial with GCP. The TMF really is the foundation of your clinical study. If it's maintained properly with timely filing and comprehensive quality checks, your TMF will be a complete, accurate, up-to-date, standalone set of documentation that can tell the story of your study without the need for any additional explanation. And it's ultimately what will verify that your patients' rights and safety have been protected throughout the life of your clinical trial. So on today's webinar, we will discuss the TMF document's life cycle. We're going to start with TMF infrastructure, which is really what dictates what a day in the life of a TMF document should look like in an ideal world. And then we'll follow a document all the way from its creation through to a possible regulatory inspection. So when we talk about TMF infrastructure, really what are the processes and tools that are needed to provide a strong foundation for your TMF? So well-developed processes, when they're followed, are really what ensures continuous inspection readiness and really sets you up for success from day one on your trials. It should go without saying that all of your process around TMF should be formally documented, whether that's in SOPs, work instructions, job aids, and then those materials should be easily accessible to everyone that's working on the TMF. Anyone who's going to be working in TMF should also be required to train on any of the processes and supporting documentation around TMF management. So you want your TMF process documentation to really define the expectation for three main things. We want to define expectations for TMF timeliness. So this could be an example of how long you may have to submit documents into the TMF once they've been finalized. We want to have expectations set for what are the quality levels that we're looking for. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. And then also, what are the expectations for completeness? What is the documentation that we expect to see filed within the TMF? I mean, this really is a lot more than just what the ICH Section 8 documents specify. And so we can use tools such as TMF indices to help support those completeness expectations, which we'll also talk about a little bit later in this lesson. So this slide really highlights various different quality specifications that should be included in your TMF process. So the first piece, we really want to specify what are the QC criteria. So what are the criteria that need to be reviewed and met in order for a document to pass QC and be filed within your TMF. So this would be things like confirmation that your document is legible, that it's complete, that all the pages are present in the correct order, those types of checks. And bear in mind that some of the QC checks you perform on a document may vary by the document type. For instance, if one of your criteria is to check that all signature lines are complete, not all documents may have signature lines. It's also good to define some QC cross-checks. And this is a part of quality and also ties in a bit to completeness. So an example of this would be if you're performing QC on a 1572, does everyone who's listed on the 1572 have a CV filed in the TMF in its respective location? The next quality aspect that we really want to define within our process is the quality level. So what is the threshold? This could be at the company level, at the program level, and at the study level. What's an acceptable error rate when you're performing QC checks? When do we start to get concerned if we're seeing what percentage of quality issues become a red flag? And then you want to make sure that you have a clearly defined path of escalation if and when that threshold is surpassed. So this could be things like escalating it to a TMF director and having additional requirements for performing more QC, perhaps retraining, things like that. Just making sure that that quality level and that threshold that you set is constantly being monitored, and if it's surpassed, like we said, having clearly defined follow-up actions that need to be completed. And the last piece is really important to define what's the minimum percentage of documents that we need to QC. So we recommend at LMK performing a QC of every single TMF document at the time when it's submitted. So this review percentage would really be more for ongoing quality reviews that are performed throughout the life of a study. So this would be those periodic QC checks that you perform. What's a minimum percentage of documents that you would expect your study teams to review when they're doing those ongoing QC reviews? So once you've established TMF processes at your institution, you can always implement tools to help support and reinforce the process. I had mentioned earlier that a TMF index is a tool that we can use to support some of the completeness expectations. So the TMF index really should include all of the expected documentation that's required to tell the story of the clinical trial, because as we mentioned, the ICH GCP Section 8 is not a complete list of documents. We recommend that a company has a general TMF index template, and then each study is required to create their own specific index from it. What is a TMF index? The TMF index really functions as a roadmap for your TMF. So it's going to tell you who is responsible for filing each document. So this is going to help to avoid any duplicate filing when you have clear filing responsibilities outlined. So this could be down to a functional line. So is it a clinical document? Is it biostats? Is it a data management document? Some of this you can determine based on how your index is set up, particularly if you're using something like the TMF reference model, which is broken down into zones that tend to align fairly well with the functions. I mean, it's also important to keep in mind that if you're working with a CRO that you want to make sure that you designate on your index which documents the CRO is responsible for, versus which ones the sponsor is responsible for filing. Again, all of this helps to just avoid any duplicate filing. So the next piece, you want your index to define what do I have to file? What are the documents that are expected to go in the TMF? It's best practice always, when you have your expected document list on your index, to define clear naming and dating conventions for documents. Again, this is just to ensure consistency across all of your different document submitters. When you're creating a study-specific index, one of the steps should be to insert a column so that each study team can go down the index and indicate if there are any particular document type that may be shown on your index template that would not be applicable for that particular study. So your TMF index is also going to tell you, so for those documents that you've said you're going to maintain for your study, where are you going to file them? So this is not only what section of your TMF are you maintaining them in, but also what system of record, and bearing in mind that your TMF could be split among several different repositories. So you just want to make sure that that's all clearly defined in one central location, and a great place to do that is the TMF index. And then lastly, your TMF index can define when particular documents are expected. So you can include milestones that would indicate when a certain document would likely be filed in the TMF. That information can also be used to support your TMF completeness QCs. Because if you've hit a certain milestone and you can see which documents per your index are expected, and if those are not present when you've achieved that milestone, that could signal that there are possibly gaps within your TMF. So there are several different options when you're setting up a TMF index. So there are two commonly used models in the industry, probably the most popular of which is the TMF reference model. You may sometimes hear this referred to also as the DIA reference model. There's also the OASIS reference model, and the OASIS reference model is mapped structurally 100% to the TMF reference model, and it just adds a bit more information when it comes to metadata and things like that. You can also see companies that have their own unique TMF index structure that they've created. So maybe they don't work off of one of the reference models in the industry. The important thing to keep in mind is if you are utilizing, as a company, one of those reference models, it should always be tailored to meet your company's specific TMF and SOP requirements. So that could be tailoring some of the document or artifact names to reflect what those particular document types are called at your company, or if there are additional documents or things that are required that may not be reflected in the model, making sure that those are added in the applicable section so that all of your study teams know what documents they need to collect. So there are also tools that can be used to support your TMF QC activities. We really recommend that every study has a TMF QC plan in place, either as a standalone document or as part of a broader TMF plan. The TMF QC plan should really define the who, the what, and the when for your QC. So the who is going to be the responsibility. So who has to perform the QC? The what would be your scope, or what has to be QC during each QC cycle. And then the when is your schedule. So when does each QC have to be performed? And then the how, which is how would you conduct your QC, that's what should be defined within your process and then reinforced with training. So good tools to have in place at your organization are a TMF QC plan template. So on the previous slide, we talked about creating that study-specific TMF QC plan, which you really should develop for each individual study. But it's a good idea to have a template at your organization so that you can ensure a consistency across all of your studies on how that information is captured. This document, as we mentioned, would have the scope, the responsibilities, and the schedule. It could also include additional information on QC criteria and quality thresholds if those are not defined elsewhere in TMF process, or if there are any nuances or anything additional to be considered for a particular study. And you also want to make sure that you have a TMF QC tracker template in place. So this is what you would use to document your QC. So as we can see here, it's going to detail the QC findings. We recommend having a column included for your QC status so that you can see what QC findings are still open and have not been addressed yet. There are several options. You can track this information using an Excel spreadsheet. You can also, if you want to move online, you can use an electronic platform like SharePoint, or there are also some eTMF platforms now that allow you to track some QC directly within the eTMF system. If you are using one of the trackers, we do recommend that you actually not file that complete tracker within the TMF, as it is essentially an outline of all the issues you've had with your TMF to date. Instead, we recommend actually creating a QC certificate. So you can see here, that's the last tool that we have on this slide, is that QC certificate template. So study teams really should complete and file a QC certificate for each QC that they perform. And that certificate is going to indicate when the QC was done, who performed the QC, and what they reviewed. So this serves as documentation in your TMF that QC was performed in accordance with the process that you have in place. So it's still important to maintain, if you make the decision not to file those completed QC trackers, it's important to maintain those still in an accessible location, just in the event that they're ever requested by an inspector, which can certainly happen. In my experience to date, if you don't have any major red flags around your TMF during an inspection, the inspector will likely be satisfied just seeing the certificate. But every inspector is different, so you just really never know, and just always want to make sure that you're prepared. So that's the end of the first segment on TMF infrastructure. Isaiah, do we have any questions that came through?
Let's see here. Yes, it does look like we have one question here. Can I read it? It's from Anne, and it's asked, if doing a risk-based QC, how and how much should be done?
So that's a great question, and I know that a lot of companies now are moving to more of a risk-based approach to QC. And I think that it really varies by organization, and I think also by the size of your study. I think when you have a large phase 3 study, you're a bit more limited because of the volume of documentation. But I think that we would recommend typically looking at, I would say, in my past experience, I've looked at roughly 10 to 20% of documentation for each periodic QC review. And bear in mind, too, when you're doing risk-based, that you can certainly look at different document types during each of your periodic QCs to kind of spread out the type of documentation that you're able to look at over the course of a study.
Perfect. It looks like that was the only question that we had. Just as a reminder, everyone, you can still submit questions through the question pane as we continue on, and we'll answer them at the next Q&A session.
Great, thanks. All right, so moving on. So now that we've laid the groundwork for your TMF with the TMF infrastructure and you have your process and tools in place, let's take a look at the first stages in a TMF document's life cycle. Should be when a document's created and then submitted to the TMF. So TMF documents can be created or generated by many different sources. So they can come from the sponsor, various different functional lines. They can come from the CRO with the CRAs and site monitors submitting documents, and they can be generated and submitted from the sites as well. So before you submit a document to the TMF, it must be QC'd against the established QC criteria that are outlined within your TMF process and also your QC plan. So if the document creator is the person who's going to be submitting the document, he or she would be the one to perform that initial QC. And we do have cases when the document creator may not be the one who's going to submit the document into the TMF. And in those cases, the document creator really should still perform that initial QC even before they provide that document to the submitter. Just always remember that quality really does start at the moment of creation. So even if you're not the one who's doing submissions to the TMF, you really should be reviewing all of your documentation to ensure that it's of quality and meets all quality standards before providing it to someone to submit to the TMF. So once a document has passed QC, it needs to be submitted to the TMF, which involves indexing of the document to direct it to the appropriate filing location. I mean, we'll take a look at indexing in a bit more detail at the end of this segment. So this is by no means a comprehensive list of all the QC criteria you may review for a document, but it gives you a good idea of the types of things that we should be looking at when you perform document QC. So first and foremost, is the document, is it appropriate for the TMF? Is it relevant to the study? Does it really help to tell the story of a study? Is the document final? We don't want to see draft documents or track changes documents submitted to the TMF. Is the document complete? Are all fields and signatures and dates filled out if applicable? If there are signatures or fields that are not required, those should be clearly marked as not applicable. You want to make sure that your document has all of the pages present, that they're in the correct order. If there are any expected blank pages, those should be clearly marked. Is the document legible? We want to make sure that it's not skewed, that the text isn't too small to read, that it's not scanned in too dark or too light. Maybe we want to make sure that any personally identifiable information is completely redacted if there's any of that on the document. So that would be things like patient's full name, complete date of birth, medical record numbers, things like that. So there are a few additional considerations for electronic documents if you're uploading those directly into an eTMF. So the first one is to consider if your document has hyperlinks. We actually recommend trying to avoid this if at all possible, just because there's a chance that those hyperlinks, even if they're functional at the time of upload, that in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the road, they may no longer be functional, and that could pose an issue. But if you do have documents that have hyperlinks and you do retain those within your TMF, just make sure that they're all functional post-upload. The next piece is to make sure that your format of your documents is compatible with whatever eTMF platform you're using. So make sure that your platform can accept native file formats if you're submitting a document as an Excel file or a Word document. Then the last piece is to be wary of encrypted or password protected documents, because oftentimes you'll find when you upload those to an eTMF platform that you won't be able to open or view them. So you want to make sure that you have documents that are not encrypted or that are unlocked if they are password protected when you submit them to the TMF. So you may have situations where you have paper documents that need to be scanned into an eTMF. So I know as we move more to eTMF, we're trying to move away from paper, but a lot of organizations do still have a certain percentage of their documents that come in, so maybe wedding documents or things like that that do need to be scanned into the eTMF. And for those documents, we require this additional image QC to be performed. So that's really to confirm that the electronic recreation that you've made of that paper document through the scanning process is truly an exact replica of the original. When you scan, you want to make sure that the pages have not been scanned, that they're not skewed, that they're still legible and not too light or too dark, that it's a clean image. We don't see any speckles or spots on the image. And that all of the pages are in the proper orientation. So if a page reads landscape, you want to make sure that it's viewable as a landscape document within your eTMF. If it's portrait, same goes for that. So you'll see here, there's a couple of examples of documents that would obviously not pass an image QC. This one's clearly too dark. So these would both fail image QC, and you would have to rescan the document before submitting it. So once you've confirmed a document meets all of the defined QC criteria, you're going to refer to your TMF index to determine, first and foremost, who's responsible for filing that particular document that you have. If the document is another function or the CRO's responsibility to file, don't file that document or you risk creating a duplicate. If you see that the document's not been filed when you go into the eTMF, the best course of action would be to follow up with the responsible party to ensure that they file it. If you do find that it's your responsibility to file the document that you have, then you're going to look at your index to see where do you file it. So what system of record is it filed in, and what's the section of the TMF that it goes in. And then to specify the filing location, you could either use, if you're submitting a paper document, you can use a cover sheet, or if you're submitting it or uploading directly to an eTMF, you can just apply the appropriate metadata to direct it to the right location. So this slide shows some of the index information that can be helpful to include. So for the location information, you're going to want to say what a document level the applicable document is. Is it a trial document, a country level document, or a site level document? What's the document type? Is it a 1572, a CV? If you're utilizing the reference model, you could provide the section and the artifact name. Additional information that's helpful to include is a document name and a document date. As we said, it's helpful to include conventions for both of those within your TMF index just to increase consistency across all of your submitters. And then you can also include a version date and an expiry date if either of those fields are applicable. So that brings us to the end of the second section. Do we have any questions regarding any of that material?
Thank you, Jackie. It looks like we do have another question. It's from Sebash, and it is, how can a modern eTMF help with the TMF index planning process? Do you have any recommendations?
So I would say that a lot of the eTMF platforms that we see today, some of the more popular ones, are configured in accordance with the TMF reference model. So I think that that's always a good place to start when you're thinking about creating a TMF index for your particular study, just because that really is probably the most comprehensive list of expected documents that we have in the industry. You can certainly, I know most of the eTMF platforms will allow you to make modifications to the index structure if you need to for your organization to customize it. As we mentioned how important that is to make sure that your index clearly aligns with your company's SOP requirements and document expectations. And most of them also allow, too, if you have an independent index structure, they can configure it according to that as well. But I think by default, a lot of them are, like I mentioned, set up according to the reference model. Are there any other questions?
It looks like that was the only one for this section.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, so now we'll move on to talk a little bit about TMF QC. So although every individual document should have been QC'd individually prior to being submitted to the TMF, it's still important to QC your TMF as a whole to confirm that all the expected documentation is present and that no quality issues were missed at the time of document submission. So TMF QC, it involves thorough planning, the use of proper tools to conduct and document QC, and prompt resolution of any QC findings by means of corrective action. And the QC really must be performed on a continuous basis throughout the study to ensure continued inspection readiness. So when approaching TMF QC, the tendency, and we see this quite a lot, the tendency is often to just develop a TMF inventory, which is really just a listing of all the documents that are present in the TMF at a certain point in time. And while this approach may provide you some visibility into glaring gaps that you may have in your files, it won't give you the whole picture. So for example, if you were to look at an inventory and you saw versions 1, 3, and 5 of an ICF, you can deduce from that that you need to find versions 2 and 4, that those are missing. But if you were also supposed to have versions 6, 7, and 8, you would have no way of knowing that those needed to be present if you were just creating an inventory. So companies really should strive for a true review of their TMF based on the expectations of what should be in the files at the time when QC is performed. So true TMF QC really is more than just populating an inventory. It involves preparation, the use of proper tools, and corrective actions. But how do you really know what you need to expect for documentation within your TMF? So there are several different tools that you can use to help to determine what your study-specific expectations would be. So the first of which would be what we often hear referred to as a storyboard within the industry. So this can be used to track unique information for your study, such as milestones, if there were any unique study events that occurred. You can use it to do version tracking. But in order for this document to be useful, it really needs to be reviewed and updated on an ongoing basis throughout the study in order to ensure that the information is current and up to date. The second tool that you can use is an expected document list. So you would generate this list at study start and then update it as study events occur that would impact TMF documentation. So say you had a protocol amendment that required ICF updates, you would want to make sure that all of that new documentation that's going to be generated is added to the expected document list. And there are some eTMF platforms that now actually have the ability to track and document some of this information in the system about what you expect for documentation. And you also want to be sure to carefully review the study's reference documents. So this could be the protocol, the IB, the monitoring plan, really to understand what are the study requirements, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, what's used for, what are we using for IP, what are we using when we're looking at accountability? Are we going to be looking at accountability logs for multiple different study drugs? Are we going to be looking for particular questionnaires that we know patients used, things like that. And then finally, we want to look at make sure that we've accounted for all of the essential documents. So we can, as a starting point, use that ICH GCP Section 8 list of documents. But as we know, that's not comprehensive. So we also recommend, even if you don't use the reference model for your particular company's index, also just looking at that just as a reference for what's the additional types of documents that we would expect to see in a TMF in order to consider it complete. So the key takeaway here is really, in order to identify what's missing on your particular study, you need to know what you expect. So when you're performing your QC, we recommend that you have a QC checklist or a QC guide that outlines what all the pass-fail criteria are. So this can help to align your document submitters with a document management team, if you have someone that's cross-checking what the submitters have added to the TMF. It just ensures that everyone is utilizing the same criteria when they perform QC. And then, as we mentioned, we want to also have a way of documenting any QC that we performed. So that QC tracker would be used to document those spot checks that you performed throughout the life of the study. And this may be an Excel tracker or the SharePoint site, or you can document it within your eTMF platform if the system allows you to do so. So when it comes to corrective action, our motto really is find it, fix it. The quicker you can identify and close issues, the better. The longer you wait, you may not be able to find what you need in order to close an issue. The person who created a document or whose signature might be missing may have left the company. So we really just recommend resolution of issues in a timely manner, ideally within 30 days of identifying an issue. So talk about a little bit about note to files. I know this is everyone's favorite TMF topic, and I can really guarantee that basically everyone on this call is likely overusing note to files within their TMF. I mean, generally, note to files are not going to be sufficient for closing QC findings. I mean, you really can't just put a note to file in to say this document is missing, period, end of story, and think that's sufficient. If you do choose to use a note to file, I mean, it really must be informative. It should state what the issue is and what you've done in an attempt to remedy it, and what corrective action is being taken to ensure that that issue doesn't occur again in the future. So it's important to ensure that your QC is followed all the way through to completion, and that all of the issues you've identified have been resolved. This is often much easier to accomplish when there's clear accountability for who is expected to resolve each issue. We actually recommend including that information for accountability directly within the TMF QC tracker itself, so that each issue has someone assigned who has to review it and resolve it. So again, key takeaway for corrective action is really to find it, fix it for any and all issues you identify as part of QC. So there are 3 different types of QC that you can really perform on your TMF. So the first is prospective QC, and this is really what constitutes that continued inspection. So this is an ongoing QC of the TMF content that you're going to perform throughout the duration of your study. So you would utilize an expected document list that would be created at the start of a study. And then you would review that expected document list against what's actually filed within your TMF when you perform QC. So this should be defined, performed at defined intervals per your TMF QC plan. The second type of QC is retrospective QC. So this is QC that needs to be performed when you haven't been doing ongoing QC. We don't recommend taking this approach because you may not have the resources or some of that storyboarding information to really do a true QC of your TMF. And then the last type of QC is an oversight QC. So this is really used to identify poor filing practices and hopefully address them in a timely manner. So there are several different types of oversight QC that I would say we typically see within the TMF. So the first one would be a sponsor TMF oversight. So this might be a doc management group or a QA group at a sponsor, at a CRO organization, reviewing their own organization's files. We would also see at times doing some CRO TMF oversight. So this would be when a sponsor, or oftentimes members of the study team, would go and review the CRO's TMF at defined intervals just to ensure that they're adhering to their QC processes and then that they're identifying and remedying any quality issues in a timely manner. So ideally your TMF QC should really include that prospective and oversight QC that's being performed regularly throughout the life of your trial. So throughout this segment, we've talked a lot about performing QC on an ongoing basis or at regular intervals throughout the life of your trial, but how do you define the timing of the reviews? So there are several different approaches that you can take to TMF QC timing. So you can take a milestone-based approach. So maybe there are particular milestones that trigger a QC review. Maybe it's once your protocol is approved or once your site's activated or at a database lock. So that's one approach. You can also take a calendar-based approach. So that would say we perform QC on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. You take a phase-based approach. So your approach to QC and how often do you do QC would vary depending on the phase of your study. And then finally, risk-based, which I know we touched on with that question in the first segment. So this would be where documents would be selected for QC based on their likelihood of inspection. So you would focus your QC on those documents that we think would be more likely to be looked at in the event of an inspection. So whichever approach you choose, you want to make sure obviously it's in line with your company's QC process and also that it's clearly defined within your TMF QC plan. So do we have any questions on that segment?
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, we do have a question. It's from Andrea. She wants to know, do you see the storyboard and unexpected document list as separate documents in Word or Excel, or how do you normally see these?
So I've seen various different approaches. I think I would say that I typically see them as two separate documents or as two separate tabs in a workbook. Just because in my mind, the stuff that you have documented on your storyboard, that's more of your milestones, your events, things like that. And then your expected document list is really a more comprehensive listing of documents, the actual documents that you would expect to see within your TMF. But I could see combining them into one if that approach worked for your organization. But to date, I've usually seen them split. Do we have any other questions?
It looks like that's the only one for this section.
Great. All right. So moving on. So you've been submitting your documents and performing your QC, but you're likely doing that just on a functional level. So I think sometimes it feels as though we get a little bit of tunnel vision with our TMF because typically most submitters work within a subset of documents within the TMF. So how do you know the state of your TMF as a whole, or even broader than that, how do you know the state of your TMF across multiple studies or as a whole company? And the answer to that really is through the use of metrics. So TMF metrics can range from very simple to very complex. The degree of complexity for the metrics often depends on what TMF format you're using and what system capabilities you have. So frequently you'll see more of the simple metrics used for if you maintain a paper TMF, because it's often a lot more manual to pull metrics and things like that from a paper TMF than it is from an eTMF platform. So as you can see here, this is an example of a quality metric. So the simplest metric for quality would be to just look at the percentage of documents that failed QC out of the total number of documents that have been filed. More complex metrics, you could start to break that fail rate down by different categories, and we'll take a closer look at that in a few slides. So the next few examples of metrics outputs that we'll look at are all related to TMF quality, but you can also, and we would also recommend that you create metrics for timeliness and completeness. So in this example, you can see that of the total number of documents that have been filed, 707 have failed QC. So that's an 8% of the total documents have failed QC. So if your company's acceptable error rate or threshold was 5%, this study would have exceeded that threshold, and additional QC or retraining or things that may be required. So this is where we talked about if you're starting to generate more complex TMF metrics, you could take that fail rate and break it down by protocol. You could break it down by site. You could break it down by country, by document level. You could look at particular document types, functional lines. You can get as granular as looking at the submitter's individual fail rates. You can look at fail rates by vendor, by CRO, by milestone, or by QC finding. So the possibilities really are endless when your metrics program is set up correctly. So these next slides are just a couple of examples looking at breaking down your fail rate by a few of the different examples we gave there. So this first slide shows the pass-fail broken down by document level. So you can see the number of documents at each level that passed and failed for this particular study. This graph here shows how many documents failed according to each functional line. So you can see here that the country and site management team has a noticeably higher error rate than all of the other functions that are shown here. So that might prompt something like additional retraining for that group. Maybe they're not clear on the filing practices or the QC criteria. This last graph here, we can see that this is where if the fail rate is broken down by the QC finding type. And we can see that there are a high number of duplicate documents here. So that could indicate that your filing responsibilities aren't clear, since it appears that multiple people are filing the same document. So this metrics finding could prompt a process change to ensure that your TMF index more clearly indicates who's responsible for filing. So as mentioned, all of these examples that we just looked at are around TMF quality metrics outputs. But to assess timeliness, you could compare the document dates to the submission dates and look at the average length of time it takes to submit a document to the TMF. And to get a feel for completeness of your studies, if you're utilizing an eTMF with placeholders, you could compare the number of expected documents, so those would be your empty unfilled placeholders, versus the number of actual documents that have been filled into those placeholders. And then you could report metrics on both of those criteria. So as we've seen in the few examples that were provided in this segment, metrics outputs can prompt a variety of different outcomes. So if you hit an error threshold, you might be required to perform some additional QC. If you've noticed that your process is creating confusion, you might be required to do some process improvements, as we saw where we had the duplicates and it maybe had a lot of people filing the same documents. You may be required to do some training or retraining if you see that a particular function or maybe just a single submitter is having a noticeably higher error rate. Or you might see that you need to make some resource allocation changes if your timeliness is lagging for a particular project. So metrics really are a helpful window just into your overall TMF health. So we always recommend that companies put a metrics program in place that can grow with you and your TMF as it matures. Do we have any questions on that segment?
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Let's see here. Okay, so we actually got a series of questions here from Anne. How should we determine what overall fail rate is acceptable?
So I would say typically in my experience, I would say no more than 5%. I've seen some companies even be as stringent as 3%. You really want to stress the importance of quality and of that initial QC before documents are submitted to the TMF. It just, one, because I think it saves so much effort and manpower down the line correcting those issues once they've been submitted. So I really think that it pays off in order to have really clearly defined QC criteria, expectations that all of your users are trained on, and really setting that that QC threshold pretty high.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. And then there's another question from Anne as well. It's, what is a best practice or average that people are using?
Is that for, I think that question is probably similar to the first one, for the average percent that people are using when we're talking about fail rates. So again, like I said, I would recommend no more than 5, but I think that if you develop very robust process and training, I could see it even being set lower, even like a 3%.
Okay, it looks like Ed is looking for some guidance on developing a plan.
A plan for a metrics program?
Okay, looks like we answered her question.
Okay. So I was going to say, if that is a question about where to start in developing a metrics program, I would say that in the beginning, less is more. So just start simple with simple metrics that are relatively easy to run. So I would recommend even just start with one basic quality, one basic completeness, and one basic timeliness metric, and just start running those. This could be, depending on your resourcing, maybe on a monthly basis. And then as your TMF process matures, you can add in more metrics as you grow.
Okay, and then we have a question from Sebastian. It looks like wants to see more examples of timeliness and completeness metrics.
Okay, that could be something, we could certainly send out more examples of those after the call when we send out the recording. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, it looks like that is all the questions we have for this section.
Okay, great. All right, so the last portion of today's training, we're going to talk about inspection readiness. So how do you really ensure that your TMF is inspection ready?
So first off, what does it mean to be inspection readiness, and what is TMF inspection readiness? So it's really being prepared for an inspector to reconstruct the clinical trial conduct from a review of the TMF, the data, and the metadata. And keep in mind that an inspection can occur at any point in a trial. Inspections are not always the result of a filing. There can be routine and for-cause inspections that can be conducted while a study is still ongoing.
So when an inspector shows up to conduct an inspection, their goal is really to evaluate the compliance of your trial with applicable legislation and GCP. So they're there to confirm that your patient rights and safety have been protected and that the clinical trial data that you've produced is reliable. So when does inspection readiness start? So it really does start at day one. So as we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, a well-developed TMF infrastructure is really what sets you up for success. So ensuring that you have robust process and tools in place to support your TMF. That ongoing TMF QC, so both the prospective and oversight QC, is really what enables you to quickly identify and address any QC issues or trends when they arise, so they don't grow into a larger issue. And then lastly, TMF metrics are really what allow you to keep your finger on the pulse of your TMF and ensure that any systemic quality, completeness, or timeliness issues are addressed in a prompt and timely fashion. So how do I ensure that my TMF is inspection ready? So we always want to make sure that we're following GCP first and foremost. We want to make sure that we understand the regulatory environment of the governing authority where we're conducting our trials. We want to make sure that we're following established processes at our institution. And one of the first things that an inspector will ask you for is your company's SOPs when they present themselves for an inspection. And you want to ensure that each study has a TMF index and a TMF plan in place. What are some inspection readiness pitfalls? Relying solely on that ICH GCP essential document list. As we've mentioned several times, that's not a comprehensive list of all the documents that should be within your TMF. It's a good starting point. We certainly expect all of them to be present, but there's a lot more documentation that should support that. Also, making assumptions about any regulatory expectations or regulations. We always want to make sure that we are clear on what those are. Also, we don't want to pass all the responsibility to the sponsor or the CRO. Even if your TMF is 100% outsourced to a CRO, the sponsor is still ultimately responsible for the conduct of the study, which is why that oversight QC is really vitally important in that scenario. It's not sufficient to just say, well, the CRO is managing that. That would certainly be an inspection finding. And then we also want to be sure to avoid filing documents in a panic right before an inspection. This slide here shows a great example of this. So this slide comes from Andy Fisher. So he is a senior GCP inspector for the MHRA in the UK. So one of the things I would say as we are moving more now into the world of the eTMFs is that those systems certainly have a lot of benefits to them. And they allow much better visibility and access in real time to your TMF. They allow multiple functions to file within the TMF more readily. It allows just better visibility in general when it comes to managing your TMF, but that visibility into filing and QC activities is also something that an inspector can see when they come to do an inspection. A lot of the inspectors nowadays that we're seeing are very savvy when it comes to these eTMF systems and technology, and they know how to run reports to see when documents have been added to the TMF. So they'll be able to see things like this and they'll know if a large number of documents was filed immediately prior to the inspection. So here on this graph you can see a big uptick right in advance around that June 10th date before their inspection occurred. And this was a TMF finding. So each country has its own regulatory agency, and this is obviously by no means an exhaustive list, but these three agencies are, I would say, in the countries and regions where trials are most often conducted. And so we have the FDA is the regulatory agency that would inspect you for the US. The MHRA is for UK studies, and then the EMA would inspect any studies conducted within the European Economic Area.
So if you are ever notified that an inspector is coming, here's a few do's and don'ts. So obviously you want to ensure that you started preparing for your inspection on day one of your study. You want to create that storyboard and make sure that you know what's occurred in your study, what are some of the events and risks that may have occurred, and be able to speak to those. Know and understand your company's processes for TMF and other activities as well. Understand the regulatory expectations in the region that you're performing the trial, and only answer questions that are related to your particular role. It's always appropriate and reasonable to say to an inspector that you're not the appropriate person to answer a particular question, but that you will get someone who can provide that information for them. If you're sitting in the inspection room, don't volunteer any information that's not been requested by the inspector. They have the tendency, and they have many different tactics to try to get additional information from their interviewees. So really just be sure that you answer their questions in a short, concise manner, and don't ramble on offering a bunch of additional information. And be sure not to comment on quality issues or admit any kind of non-compliance. This obviously goes without saying, but make sure that you don't ever fabricate any documents or signatures that may be missing. And lastly, make sure that you don't make any promises to an inspector that you cannot fulfill. So just to give you guys, in the last few minutes of our call, just a summary of today's training. So we started with TMF Infrastructure. So we talked about how you should have TMF process in place that will define your expectations for timeliness, quality, and completeness. You want to ensure that you put tools in place to support the process and increase your consistency and adherence to process. From there, we went and looked at the document creation and submission, so those early stages in a TMF document's life cycle. So we want to make sure that all documents are QC'd against established QC criteria before they're submitted to the TMF. And we want to rely on our TMF index to ensure that documents are filed consistently. From there, we looked at TMF QC and learned that a true TMF QC really involves preparation, the use of proper tools, and corrective action, that it's much more than just creating a TMF inventory. And we really want to see prospective and oversight QC performed throughout the duration of a study in order to ensure that continued inspection readiness. Okay. So we looked a little bit at metrics and talked about how those can be used to gauge overall TMF health and how outcomes of your metrics may result in additional QC, process improvement, additional training or resource changes. And then lastly, we talked about inspection readiness and really how important it is to start that preparation on day one and really ensure that your TMF tells the story of your study and provides the evidence that patients' rights and safety were protected and that your trial data is reliable. So we go into all the topics that we reviewed during today's webinar in much greater detail in our TMF University courses. So if anyone is interested in learning more about those, I've included a link to our website there for TMF University. And then just to wrap it up, do we have any final questions that have come through before we close the webinar?
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, we have, looks like one final question here from Anne. It looks like I've not seen the storyboard before. Where can I get a template for one or see an example?
So I can send one of those out as well after with the call recording.
Excellent. It looks like there are no further questions. Still want a couple more seconds here in case someone wants to say anything. Okay, well, thank you, Jackie, and special thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar, A Day in the Life of a TMF Document Overview. Please join us Tuesday, April 11th at 11 a.m. for a joint complimentary webinar with Montreal, where our very own CEO, Sholay Ekdaivan, will be exploring how CROs and sponsors can implement a proactive TMF inspection readiness methodology by looking at both your processes and the technology you leverage to help you manage your TMF content. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact myself or Jackie, and like she said, we will be sending out a follow-up email. This session has also been recorded, so everyone will be getting a copy of the recording within 24 to 48 hours. And from behalf of LMK Clinical Research Consulting and our presenter, Jackie, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.